Thank you, Amy. I'd just like to mention this is something we've been developing for the last 2 years together. So it's something that we feel is very pertinent and is a real challenge that needs to be addressed in the short term. Next slide, please. So in terms of what we will discuss today, we will give you a whirlwind tour of these two very pertinent topics and how they come together by discussing the what, the who, and the how. I will first try to define, based on existing knowledge, what a hard to decarbonise home is. Then Amy will talk about people who live in them, so who lives in them and why we need to tackle them, covering the links between hard to decarbonise and hard to reach energy users, what life in a hard to decarbonise home is like, and barriers to change. I'll then attempt to put forward ideas on how we can address the challenge within hard to decarbonise homes, specifically looking at the knowledge gaps, our aim for undertaking research in this area, key actions that we're putting into place, and our vision for the future in terms of what can happen if this research programme is implemented and impact is generated. At the end, Amy will summarise the key points and the key messages of the presentation. Next slide, please, Hans. So to give you some background, and I'm sure all of you are very aware of this, Europe is embarking on an ambitious green economic recovery, which will see substantial investment in the energy efficient renovation of its buildings to support the net zero transition of the sector through such things as the renovation wave, the European Green Deal, and so on and so forth. Historically, though, there's been a fundamental disconnect between large-scale efforts such as these and buildings that are viewed to be challenging to decarbonise, because perhaps the costs involved in decarbonising them will be higher, the barriers involved in decarbonising them are harder to overcome, or the solutions that we need to implement within them are more complex than what we usually use. So as a consequence, these buildings and their occupants have largely been under research and poorly understood. However, as the net zero transition becomes more entwined with issues of social and energy equity, this disconnect is no longer an option. So the main driver for our work is that we believe that our most challenging buildings need to be part of this transition to ensure that no one gets left behind. Next slide, please. So what exactly is a hard to decarbonise home? The term hard to decarbonise is usually associated with other sectors of the economy, such as heavy industry, transport, aviation even, and it is a new term within the built environment. It refers to properties where the reduction of carbon emissions is difficult to achieve, whereby they cannot be brought up to an appropriate standard of energy efficiency with currently available cost-effective measures. And the difficulties come from inherent characteristics that these buildings possess, which relate to such aspects as the building's physical attributes, so things to do with the building form, such as area and height, that might be challenging. For an example of this are high-rise buildings. Locational attributes, which describe the constraints coming from where the building is sited, such as lack of grid connectivity, remote locations, exposure and accessibility issues on site. And the third set of attributes describe the occupants, their socioeconomic and behavioural characteristics and traits, which Amy will look into more deeply in the next section. Despite increased interest in this area, relatively little is known about hard to decarbonise homes, and that makes them a significant area of uncertainty for the decarbonisation challenge. However, even in the absence of any in-depth understanding of their attributes and how many there actually are, the limited evidence that does exist suggests that they actually make up a substantial proportion of the stock in the EU. In the EU, they account for up to 20% of UK homes, or 5 million properties. And in Europe, where there's even greater uncertainty about how many there actually are, we do know, for example, that about 40 million European households, or over 100 million European citizens, live in homes which are located in rural areas and are not connected to the gas grid. So again, significant numbers in Europe. Next slide, please, Hans.
Okay, thanks, Rakaya. Just returning to the idea that you introduced about leaving nobody behind in the transition to a lower carbon society. In practice, that really means we have to understand who is most vulnerable and marginalised, and we need to prioritise their needs and ensure that they're not just disadvantaged, that they're not disadvantaged by the transition, but also that they benefit from it as well. And in that context, I think we really need to view hard to decarbonise properties as homes rather than simply houses or properties. And so we have to understand who lives in them. It's also going to be important for us to understand as much as we can about who might live in them in the future as well, and make sure that solutions that we develop through this programme of work for future occupants too. But it is, of course, the present occupants that are going to have to live through this transition and mustn't be disadvantaged by it. And as I said, they must also benefit as well. So although we're early on in this programme of work and we haven't yet established a precise profile of occupants living in HTD homes, there are really good indications from existing evidence around housing conditions in the UK that the HTD stock will be disproportionately occupied by people with multiple vulnerabilities. So I'm talking about people with income-related vulnerabilities, health vulnerabilities, and various social disadvantages as well. And we can be very sure that there is a clear correlation between poor quality housing and vulnerable occupants. Vulnerable occupants disproportionately occupy poor quality housing. So we can have a fairly good idea of who is living in this hardest 20% of properties. So we also know that given the very poor energy performance of hard to decarbonise homes and the likely vulnerabilities of occupants that I just mentioned, fuel poverty is likely to affect a very high proportion of HTD occupants, far above average levels. So I'm sure a lot of people in the audience are familiar with the concept of fuel poverty. It does tend to be quite a UK specific concept. In the rest of the world, people tend to talk about energy poverty, which is a more all-encompassing concept that takes account of all forms of domestic energy use. But in the UK, we talk about fuel poverty, and it's really about a household's ability at the simplest level to be able to afford to heat their homes to a safe and comfortable level. So there are lots and lots of ways that you can define and measure fuel poverty, and that's a seminar in itself, really. But the way you define it will directly affect how much of a problem it appears to be. So the latest definition that's been developed by the UK government, and they released their description of this last autumn, focuses on those who have both a low income and live in a low energy efficiency dwelling. And that definition is actually going to increase the number of households in energy poverty, on paper at least, by about 6%, whereas the predecessor definition, which focused on those who are on a low income but have high energy costs, actually reduced the number of households in fuel poverty, on paper only, of course, because of course all this sort of tweaking around with statistics doesn't really affect the lived experience of those who are struggling to heat their homes to a comfortable level. So to avoid getting bogged down in the debate about how we measure fuel poverty, we can fairly confidently say that around 3.5 million households in the UK are in fuel poverty. Sorry, not in the UK, in England, because each country in the UK defines fuel poverty differently and measures it differently. So we can only really talk about England in this context. And that number we know has increased quite substantially as a result of COVID and the associated income reductions that's brought, and the increased heating costs due to more time spent at home. So we know that around 600,000 more households have been pushed into energy poverty as a result of the pandemic. And obviously those already experiencing fuel poverty are likely to have experienced a deepened level of it as a result of COVID. So we're also likely to see more households falling into fuel poverty as a result of the gas price crisis, which you can't avoid hearing about at the moment. But interestingly, those households that are pushed into fuel poverty as a result of the gas price crisis will not be picked up by official statistics from the UK government, because energy pricing is no longer a part of of the UK's definition of fuel poverty. But those people will be picked up in other statistics, sadly those around excess winter deaths in particular, and I'll return to that issue in a moment. So we know that around 60% of fuel poor households live in homes that are rated between E to G on the Energy Performance Certificate scale in England. Now, an E to G property is either a hard to decarbonise property or the owner of it is not acting to improve it. So, for example, private landlords are likely to resist improving properties for various reasons, some of them to do with the characteristics of the property, but certainly not all of them. So these kinds of dilemmas are also very much part of the hard to decarbonise research agenda, because buildings aren't just hard to decarbonise due to their physical characteristics. There is also significant interaction, as Rukaya pointed out, with their owners and with their occupants and their motivations. So 38% of fuel poor households in England live in the private rented sector, where we have the worst energy efficiency, and as I said, where there is little motivation for landlords to act. So we expect a significant proportion of hard to decarbonise homes to be found in the private rented sector. Fuel poor households also tend to live in older housing, 18% roughly in pre-1919 dwellings, and over 50% if you look at pre-1944 dwellings, which will naturally also be hard to decarbonise because of their age, their physical characteristics. So ultimately, those who are living in hard to decarbonise homes are at greater risk of premature death than their counterparts. So around 8,000 people will die each winter in the UK as a direct result of cold homes and associated illnesses. And of course, many millions more will not necessarily die of it, but will feel the physiological and psychological effects of living in a cold home. So this is a life and death situation. These are very, very serious consequences that it should be very difficult to ignore. So if we don't find solutions for this toughest 20% of properties, we're putting a lot of vulnerable people at significant risk of harm during every winter that passes when we don't have a solution. Next slide, please. So to just quickly summarise the relationship between fuel poverty and hard to decarbonise homes, living in a hard to decarbonise home makes fuel poverty more likely. And because the least desirable housing stock it tends to be hard to decarbonise, those with the least choice are more likely to end up in them. And those with the least choice usually means vulnerable low-income households. But it's important to remember also that there are other types of hard to decarbonise: occupant, including those who might have a good income but face high heating costs. And we still need to look at those properties. We still need to tackle them in the interest of carbon reduction. But if you're thinking about justice and equity, those properties, those occupants are probably not our priority. Next slide, please. So we very much badged this presentation as focusing on the linkages between hard to decarbonise homes and hard to reach people, but I'm not sure that so far we've really highlighted these links explicitly enough, so I'll attempt to do that on this slide. So it's really our work on hard to reach energy users that led to us being here today, because it's the focus of a users TCP annex that I'm involved with alongside many other colleagues around the world. So the annex recognises that the term hard to reach is bandied around an awful lot, but it's very poorly defined and it's very poorly understood. And our research has shown that policymakers, practitioners and academics all around the world overwhelmingly think of the term hard to reach as being intrinsically linked to being on a low income. And as a result of this very narrow conceptualization, a lot of people get overlooked as a result. So a key aim of the annex really is to rethink the concept and more accurately characterize what it can mean in an energy context. So challenging these rather narrow notions that low income is the main thing that make people hard to engage. So the emerging evidence coming out of this project, which is just over halfway through, is challenging us to think of hard to reach as going far beyond low-income households. And in relation to low-income households, it's important to remember that they're not always hard to reach. They're not a homogeneous group, they're an extremely heterogeneous group in their own right. And it's also prompting us to move beyond the idea that being hard to reach is all about being difficult to communicate with. So I would argue that we're all of us in this webinar today are hard to reach in some, if not multiple ways, even if it's just in the sense that our ears are closed to certain messages that we think aren't aimed at us, don't concern us, a sort of form of exceptionalism. And through the project, we've also identified groups such as very high consumers of energy and even policymakers in certain areas that could be considered hard to reach. So you can see the definition of hard to reach that we've developed through the annex that's in a box on the slide. And you see that it encompasses this idea of being underserved, which really means that a vital service or initiative either doesn't reach us or encompasses a particular group or groups, or doesn't really fully respond to the needs of particular groups. So in this sense, I would argue that anybody who's in fuel poverty is actually being underserved in some way. And in the same vein, I'd argue that anyone who's living in or owns a hard to decarbonise property could be argued to be hard to reach or underserved, which is part of being hard to reach, because they probably can't see how what's on offer in terms of energy efficiency, decarbonisation fits with their circumstances and their needs. And in reality, what is on offer mostly so far isn't based on the needs of hard to decarbonise properties or their occupants and owners. It's focused very much on the low-hanging fruit of easier to treat homes. And that's what we're saying has now got to change. So the research coming out of the annex suggests that the problem really goes back to a lack of diversity amongst those who design solutions to energy related problems. So whether it's working out what to do with hard to decarbonise homes or developing an energy advice scheme or an energy affordability initiative, those designing them tend to design initiatives for people like them, and they tend to emanate from a very narrow demographic profile. So there's a real need to promote diversity amongst those developing the solutions to these problems, and that's something we need to heed in our research programme as well. Next slide, please. So what's it like living in a hard to decarbonise home? We've done a lot of qualitative research into the lived experience of fuel poverty and the daily challenges that the fuel poor have to navigate, and that does give us quite a lot of insight into the life of somebody living in a hard to decarbonise home. And there are a few quotes on this slide you can see there, and they've actually come from recent research undertaken in April 2020 about being fuel poor during lockdown. And they illustrate some of the often less than perfect coping strategies that are employed by fuel poor households to avoid or offset the worst effects of cold homes and high heating costs. And of course, many of these coping strategies were cut off, at least at times, by the pandemic, of course, but they do give some insight into the challenges and struggles. So we found people, in order to cope with cold homes, spending as much time outside of the house as they could, so spending extra time at work or even at the homes of family and friends. We found people eating food cold from tins and packets to avoid using energy to warm it. We found people living off the cheapest, poorest quality foods to free up money for other expenses. We found people hanging around in cafes, libraries, shopping centres, other public spaces for prolonged periods to avoid being at home. And we found people doing things like distracting children from the fact that it was cold at home by doing running races with them, things like that. And also a number of studies have identified how fuel poor households use simple strategies like sitting under blankets and leaving their coats on in the house as a common coping mechanism. Next slide, please. So those quotes not only demonstrate the kind of emotional and physical labour of living in a home with poor thermal performance and or not enough heat going into it, but there's also something else to say about that. And that's for all the misery that living under these conditions can bring, such households may not jump at the chance to change their circumstances quite as quickly as you might imagine. So we've found through our research that people living in these circumstances often have an awful lot going on in their lives. Their lives are much more likely to be precarious and highly complex. So the focus in daily life is firmly on survival and those kind of sticking plaster solutions that I just described in the previous slide. So the root causes of their problems are often far outside of their influence. So asking people in these circumstances to think longer term about the benefits of insulation or a new heating system, that's asking them to look far beyond their likely length of tenancy and their normal time horizons. And it's asking them to contemplate a lot of disruption that they might not be able to face due to the complexity of their lives. So the coping strategies that I outlined are really very entrenched for many. They form part of a really rigid daily routine that's relied upon to bring a degree of comfort and predictability to a difficult life. And as miserable as a cold home is, we found that the majority of fuel poor households that we've spoken to don't know their rights in this regard, and they don't know where to turn to for help. And they may not even view their circumstances as unusual or even unacceptable. Now, private rented sector tenants in particular are often too scared to complain to landlords given such high demand for rental properties and their weak position in the market. And in owner occupation, the high upfront costs can be prohibitive or at least off-putting. Next slide, please. So this is my final slide, and this slide is really just about making the point that the upfront pain and challenges of resolving the issues around hard to decarbonise homes can really loom large, while the benefits can feel quite distant and downstream. Okay, I'm going to hand back to Rakaya now.
Thank you, Amy. Hans, next slide, please. So despite because of all of these challenges that Amy has listed, there are strong indications on the policy front that hard to decarbonise homes are expected to be an area of policy focus in the near term. For example, in the 5th carbon budget in the UK, the last one, they were identified as one of the key areas where options to reduce emissions were more difficult. However, in the 2019 net zero report, they were considered to be one of the core areas of the further ambition option that was needed to go beyond an 80% reduction target. Although this firmly placed hard to decarbonise homes on the policy radar in the UK, more ambitious action is needed. An example of how current policy does not yet adequately address this is the December 2020 Energy White Paper, which does not go far enough. Even though its principles support a fairer deal for energy consumers, it actually falls short of the long-term solutions needed for those who live in hard to decarbonise homes, simply because it asks that only homes where it is cost effective to target an improvement are the ones that are going to be improved. So again, the issue of cost effectiveness is hampering work in this area. In the EU, we see similarly encouraging signs of increased focus on hard to decarbonise homes, and where to tackle energy poverty in rural areas, the EU plans to launch a communication on the long-term vision for rural areas and homes within them. So it's a key hard to decarbonise typology, and the debate is going to be starting on that next year in 2022. Next slide, please. So how should we tackle these homes and all these complex problems? Research and common sense agree that the most effective method is an integrated one that involves knowledge, technology, policy, finance, and the people themselves. Next slide, please. But there are several key knowledge gaps that we need to answer to ensure that whatever strategy that we formulate is actually one that is effective. Existing research, as we've mentioned earlier, mostly focuses on housing types with standard characteristics, and for good reason. You know, the low-hanging fruit are the most common types, they're the easiest to go for. So all research efforts have really mainly looked at these houses. But as a result, we have very limited understanding of the physical, locational, occupant-related attributes that we mentioned earlier and that Amy kind of expanded on the occupant front. In addition, I come from a modelling background, and I can very safely say that we currently do not have any fit-for-purpose models in place that can help us try and understand the hard-to-decarbonise stock. This is because models that we have generally rely on sampling methods that generate archetypes, which are representative of the more common or standard stock characteristics again. So the models themselves, they don't adequately mirror the houses that we need to study in this area. So next slide, please. So how do we know about these knowledge gaps and challenges? Well, the short answer is we've tried to research the hard-to-decarbonise stock as part of preliminary work we undertook for the Climate Change Committee in the UK to inform their 2019 net zero advice. This work highlighted the importance of the stock segment, but also highlighted the massive knowledge gaps that existed and that I just referred to. Next slide, please. So Amy and I teamed up to develop a program of work that aimed to meet the critical need for a robust hard-to-decarbonise evidence base through the implementation of an ambitious program of interdisciplinary research that aims to better understand the sector and its occupants. And our ultimate goal in applying this program is to shape appropriate solutions that emphasize decarbonisation as a pathway to energy equity. Next slide, please. Our program will be based on 3 key actions. The first is understanding, the second is finding the solutions, and the third is creating the legacy and impact of this work, which I'll detail on the next slide. So in terms of understanding, we aim to develop an understanding of what exactly makes a home hard to decarbonise. We have some initial ideas that we discussed today, but we need to find out more through analysing the building stock in depth. We need to implement an ambitious research programme to research the lived-in experiences of occupying these homes and to develop personas that represent nuanced profiles and provide insights into behavioural variations among people who live in hard-to-decarbonise homes. And of course, we need to develop models that better represent the homes and their occupants. Based on the evidence base and the models that we hope to create, we aim to formulate tailored strategies for decarbonising hard-to-decarbonise homes. We aim to link up to system level models to assess the impact and the trade-offs that will be associated with decarbonising them. And we really hope to engage in a bottom-up process where we can co-produce regionally focused scenarios where clusters of these homes exist to inform the formulation of local strategy and targets. And in terms of impact, we aim to create a hard-to-decarbonise energy equity network to bring together relevant policy and research stakeholders in this area to ensure the wider applicability and transferability of the research and the analysis frameworks we hope to produce. Next slide, please. So what can happen? Our future vision of the impact that this work can have is actually one that can be realised very much in the near future. Given that the majority of energy efficiency in homes will need to be installed in the next decade or so. 2 things to bear in mind. Because hard-to-decarbonise homes are an area where innovation will play a significant role in finding the right solutions, they can actually act as a catalyst for innovation and economic activity across the building sector. By doing this, they can become a key component of the green economic recovery, modernising how we do things and supporting job creation. So their impact can be wider than just these homes. And also, as Amy pointed out, as occupants of hard-to-decarbonise homes are now more than ever likely to be more susceptible to fuel poverty and heat risks, finding solutions that work will improve the well-being of some of the most vulnerable groups in society. So our vision is that this green recovery and green transition can very much also be a just transition that leaves no one behind. Next slide, please.
Okay, so I'm just going to finish off the presentation by kind of recapping on some of the key points that we'd like to leave you with. So the net zero transition is deeply entwined with issues of social and energy equity, and hopefully we've conveyed that in this presentation. And these kind of challenging buildings that have been left behind in pursuit of the low-hanging fruit can no longer be overlooked, and it's time to find solutions for them too. Hard to decarbonise homes, by very definition, are the most challenging segment within this. They're kind of the final frontier. And it's time to embrace the challenges associated with them. I've talked about how the most vulnerable households are concentrated in the poorest quality housing in this country, at least, and this adds greater impetus to and really underlines the need for a just approach that prioritises need over ability to pay. Hard to decarbonise homes and fuel poverty, as I talked about, are not exclusively linked, but they are very, very closely related. Again, adding impetus to the need to work on this as a priority. So being hard to reach is not just about income. All hard to decarbonise occupants, and all of us more broadly, can be seen as hard to reach in some way. And it's important to have an appreciation of that when developing and targeting solutions. So despite deeply unsatisfactory conditions, change for the better can be a hard sell for some occupants of hard to decarbonise homes, with benefits feeling a long way downstream and perhaps feeling a little indirect for them. There are really strong indications that hard to decarbonise homes are expected to be an area of policy focus in the near term, and we're seeing the Home Upgrade Grant launched in the near future here in the UK, focused on off-grid properties. But yet we're going into this knowing very, very little about this particular type of housing. So there's a really critical need for a robust evidence base around hard to decarbonise homes through the implementation of our programme of interdisciplinary research. We hope that we'll be able to offer a better understanding of both the stock and its occupants. And ultimately, we're aiming here to shape the most appropriate and beneficial solutions that emphasise decarbonisation hand in hand with the achievement of energy equity. Thanks very much. And I think now we're going to have some questions from the audience.